talented, resourceful person called Ashwin Mahesh. You must have read the brief profile that we have put up on the mailers that you received the last 2, 3 days. Well, should I say good morning to those of you who are in the US or those in Europe? I must be saying good afternoon. It's 5:30 p.m. here in India today. Um, well, you all heard us speak 2 or 3 weeks ago on what India needs to be doing to go electric on its 2030 trajectory of going away from IC engines and those engines that are dependent on oil, whether it's petrol or diesel. We told ourselves that we need to do more. We asked ourselves what that is industry and government have to do to tango with each other in order to make this happen and put a sense of urgency to this process that India has sort of begun. We couldn't think of anyone better, more qualified and equipped than Dr. Ashwin Mahesh. Well, he's been an urbanist, he's a journalist, he's been a politician, he's been a regular columnist in a couple of newspapers in Bangalore. All you have to do is do a Google search, for Ashwin Mahesh, and you'll find so much more about him. He's a scientist, did his doctoral in atmospheric sciences, worked in NASA for quite some years before returning to India. His commitment to India and to the future of sustainability has been more than amply proven with the kind of dedication and commitment to public purpose that he has brought over the years. I won't say more. Anyone who will want to know more about him will, of course, check things out on the web. What is important for you to know is, and as you see here on the slide, we have talked more about his being a director, founder, director, and promoter at Lithium Urban Technologies. It's more a transportation service. It's not a cab service like Uber or the other things that you have in the market. He will tell you more as to why this position that he enjoys as a director at Lithium makes him so uniquely competent to talk about the sort of questions that we have before us in this session. About Response Cities Foundation or Responsible Cities Foundation. Those of you who are newcomers to this hour, I must tell you that we have been doing this series for the last 2 or 3 months pretty successfully. We've had all kinds of people, from urban planners and senior working professionals, right down to students of architecture, engineering, and of course MBAs. Responsible Cities Foundation has tied up with the Canadian Carleton University based in Ottawa. We have programs to offer certification. I won't tell you more. You can please check our website for those. Well, one request. There is this column on the left that shows up on your screen. Anytime you have a question or a perspective or an insight to offer, as Dr. Ashwin Mahesh is speaking, I'd like you to see that you put them up there. We will monitor it, and then at the end of the session that Ashwin will have, we will share those questions or insights with him for him to see if he will want to offer some further insight on it. Well, there we are. What's stopping India from going the electric vehicles road? It's not just cars, it's about two-wheelers, it's about everything. Presented by Responsible Cities Foundation and Carleton University. I have Dr. Ashwin Mahesh take over from here. Ashwin, can I request you to take these 21 questions and offer us whatever you think are uniquely your insights into where the industry is headed?
Yeah, thank you, Hari, and thank you for that nice introduction as well. I will go through the questions here in the webinar presentation in front of me. The first one says, sales of electric vehicles grew considerably, 37.5% last year, but there were still only 20,000 units and 2,000 of these were cars. It seems like India is still very far away from the objective of selling 6 million electric vehicles by 2020. I would agree that this is the case. At the same time, I think it's not something that I unduly worry about. It is the electric vehicle is a nascent industry here in India, and as in any other nascent industry, at the beginning, you have to organize a set of things to work well together. You have to organize manufacturing, you have to organize the services, the supporting infrastructure, the engineering talent, the outreach, the education, policy, regulation. All of this needs to be organized in some way. And therefore, the initial periods sometimes can be indeterminate or unpredictably different from what you anticipate. But once those things are in place, I think we can see a rapid acceleration of adoption after that. And so it's quite possible that we may miss some early targets, but compared to a more long-term goal, I think the numbers will really begin to stack up between 2020 and 2030, and to really hit our stride before that is the real goal, in my opinion.
Fair enough. I see that.
I'm going to move
I'll move.
on.
I will move perhaps to the next question.
Okay, in
Do you
which is,
see?
look at the difference in numbers. 350,000 electric vehicles last year alone in China. America has done 160,000. What's stopping there to take to EVs? And again, I said I would say this is a continuation of what I said in response to the previous slide. We're
Right.
in a situation where the early steps are still being put together, and it's only as those pieces come together that you're going to see the numbers taken away.
Fair enough. Okay. And this
Now,
is to do with the
on to the
two-wheelers.
next one, saying
Yes.
the two-wheeler numbers are also sort of, your phrase is not worth the mention, and small EV manufacturers are not really supported by government's legislation. China has done really well on this front with 21 million two-wheelers. So hugely, there's a leadership that's being established. And what are the regulatory changes India needs to bring in to move this market? I would say, there's more than there's a regulatory way of thinking about this, and there's a market way of thinking about this.
Right.
The market way of thinking about this is to ask the question: do we want to make electric vehicles in India, or do we want electric vehicles in India? And these are not the same question. Because if you want to make electric vehicles in India, you have to wait until production takes off. If you simply want electric vehicles in India, you only need to allow vehicles from elsewhere in the world to come to India. So I think in the government's mind that, yeah, I understand. The, the government's preference at the moment is to have vehicles that are made in India rather than vehicles be brought to India from markets outside. And maybe there are good reasons for that. Manufacturing is an important goal that the government has set for itself. But what it means is that mere availability of vehicles elsewhere is not enough. You have to actually form the ecosystem of production and use in India before you can expect to see significant numbers. And I think it will take 18, 24 months before all of that falls into place. But after that, we can begin to expect significant growth in vehicle adoption in India. Question number 18. This is essentially, it's a continuation of the kind of we've been exploring around policy in India. There is, if China has 100,000 electric buses put on the market last year alone, why are we not able to sort of come anywhere near those numbers? In fact, those numbers are bigger than our entire bus market, not just last year's bus market. And I think there are two parts of the answer to this. One is that bus-based transportation itself is an underserved market in India. In Bangalore, for example, where we claim to have the largest urban fleet of buses, which is 6,500. Even here, we would need to double the bus fleet to bring it up to global standards of bus-based service. And that tells you how much weaker the rest of the systems are. My suspicion is that we've got a very large number of buses, a deficit of buses to be made up for, even before the electric question became prominent. And perhaps the only consolation from that is that now we can make up that deficit with electric rather than continuing with fossil. But there are two parts of the answer to questions like this. One is that there are ongoing deficits in services, and alongside is the challenge of transforming to electric, and both have to be sort of carried along simultaneously. The short answer to a lot of these questions is that for the foreseeable future, we're going to spend a lot of time answering these questions about how to go forward. And it's only when those questions are answered that we'll really get momentum for new things. Norway is a very small country, introduced electric vehicle subsidies many years ago, and this year almost 1 out of 5 cars in the country is electric. And so the question that comes is, even after so many years of subsidies, they've only got to a point where 1 out of 5 cars is electric. Are we being too ambitious by thinking that by 2030 all cars are going to be electric? Yes and no. I think it's a production thing. I don't think it's too difficult to say that by 2030, the production of all cars should be electric. That's still far enough away for manufacturers to make a decision and go down that direction. The past is also not a very good indicator of the future, in my opinion, because the past includes challenges that are being overcome now, including challenges of pricing, which significantly impact adoption. My own feeling is that as the trajectory that has been taken by Norway to get where it is a good example and a learning experience for a lot of other countries, but I suspect that most of them will do it faster and better because of that learning experience. China has also subsidized a lot of local companies. And how does that help? And what should the government here in India be doing to the domestic market to encourage the shift towards electric vehicles? But Chinese manufacturing and Chinese production of various things works on a fairly you could argue against it, but it's a fairly straightforward principle that if there's a new thing that emerges and China simply becomes one of the world's largest consumers of that new thing, and in the process incentivizes production of that in China, that makes China able to do the same thing for the rest of the world's market as well, in a way that other countries are not prepared to yet. And that's how I would look at the electric vehicle thing. By a very large number of subsidies, especially nearly 50% subsidies on certain vehicles, China has basically said, go buy an electric vehicle, we'll make it worth your while. And to the individual buyer, of course, it's been worth their while. But more importantly, to Chinese vehicle manufacturing, it has put them at the front of the line production of electric vehicles, and therefore potentially able to take these technologies to other countries in the world better than anybody else can. And this is really the yield from that subsidy, a competitive strength for manufacturing, more than an internal value addition to things like air quality or transport or any of those kind of things. I think they're giving themselves manufacturing strength to remain ahead of the rest of the world. I don't think we can do things like that in India, to be honest with you. The government doesn't have the capacity to drive consumption on such large scale. And also in the Chinese economy, the state is a much more powerful actor than in the Indian economy. The government is still important in India, but the market and society are also quite important in ways that are not important in China. So I wouldn't try this approach in India. I think working as quickly as we can to bring the largest number of products and services to the market is the best thing that the government can do. And that's not really related to subsidies. That's more related to just having simple, efficient regulation and efficient processes by which these things can happen. So now we're starting to get into the guts of the vehicle. When you buy an electric car in India, more than half the cost is the battery alone. And how do you change this? I don't think it can be changed quickly. Partly battery production in India likely to take off anytime soon to the kinds of numbers that we'll need. But more importantly than that, the electric vehicle's battery has a kind of modularity, which is, we must see the value of this modularity. Even after it as a battery, that battery continues to be useful in uh, second life deployments, and therefore not the entire life of the battery is in the vehicle itself. The second thing that you could do, you could separate the cost of the battery from the cost of the vehicle by moving the battery to leasing arrangement. You would still have the same total cost of ownership, adjusting for finance, but I think it's not an electric vehicle for the battery to have a very high component cost. And I don't see that even in the future that it would come down hugely, because a very large part of the value that is derived in a car, in an electric car, is coming from that battery. The question we should be asking ourselves is, what else can this battery be used for? And how do we get the battery financed in a way that it can become competitive with ICE vehicles quickly? Then comes the question of range. A 120-kilometer range car can manage with a 15-kilometer, 200-kilometer range vehicle requires a much larger battery, and this will push up the cost of batteries alone. That can disrupt the cost and weight of the battery. It's an interesting question. In 1895, if you had asked about the limits of classical mechanics and said, is there a technology that disrupt all of this? Most people would have said, well, not that we know about, but quantum mechanics was just around the corner. I think we are in a kind of situation like that. There might be a technology that can disrupt all this, but I suspect that we don't yet know about it well enough to answer that definitively. But the chances are high, given the acceleration of science and engineering in material science and chemical engineering and fields like that. I suspect that we should not be too surprised if the answer to this question turns out to be yes in 10 or 15 years, but that's not an answer that you already know today. This is an interesting question that a lot of people ask me. Charging versus swapping. Which of these will dominate? I think in the long run, charging will dominate. And I'll tell you why. Unlike petrol and diesel and gasoline, electricity is available in every single building, which means the opportunity for charging is available in every single building. Now, we might say that, in a building, you can only do slow charging. Well, that's because the building has been built for slow charging. It's quite conceivable that in future buildings, a builder could say one or more exterior walls will include a fast charging socket. And the additional cost of that compared to the cost of that building would be minuscule. So it's quite possible that building construction technology itself will make fast charging quite common in the buildings themselves. But even if that was not true, charging is essentially about delivery of the charge to the battery. And there are many, many ways it can be done. It can be done even on the move, as we are seeing with road surface-based charging for trucks in Europe. Swapping, incidentally, a location-specific business. And fundamentally, you can think of swapping as more analogous to the fuel station, to the petrol station or the gasoline station. You go there, you give up something, and you get something back. It's a trade and a transaction that happens in a location. So it's easier to comprehend, but we must come back to the original point that we made, which is to say, you would not go to a petrol station if petrol was available in your house, except in an emergency or except to go for really long distance. So imagine that petrol is available in your house, and then ask the question again, would you go to a fuel station to fill up, or would you try to do it at home in more efficient ways? And I think it's for that reason that charging will dominate, especially if home charging technologies become greater. Then whatever charges your home, you might try to charge your car too out of that, and vice versa. What charge is not needed by your car can be fed into. So I think in the long run, charging will dominate. There may be certain applications in which swapping makes more sense, but that may be because of the nature of the application, much more than as an answer to the question of charging versus swapping. Battery manufacturing in India, well, is a bottleneck. Almost all the batteries are imported. Make in India does encourage a shift to local technology and manufacturer in a way that's powerful enough at the moment. I think we sort of have to look at this like we cars in the past or the past. There will be one day significant manufacturing in India. But the fastest way to get to significant manufacturing in India is to allow the market to grow as quickly as possible.
Again.
Now comes the question of battery manufacturing here and whether Make in India encourages the shift to local technology and manufacture. There are two ways to look at the history of manufacturing in India. If we look at the way we talk about manufacturing in the 50s and on up to the 90s, we took the view that things should be made in India, and once the manufacturing capacity is established, markets will take off. That didn't really happen. But after the 1990s, we took a more liberal view and we said maybe markets should be established first, and because of that, manufacturing will happen in India. And that has been a more successful model. And I think that's really what we should do, that we should allow the world's best things to come to India. And that's really what's going to make manufacturing possible in the country. When that happens, we'll see large battery manufacturing and resulting drops in costs and improvements in capabilities as well. So now comes one other question, which is sort of, it seems like it's 10 years away, but for a change, maybe it's not so bad to think about it ahead of time. What if we accumulate a whole bunch of batteries and what we start thinking about disposal? I think, yeah, of course you need to start thinking about disposal. All fuel will require this question to be answered in one way or the other. I don't know that very many people are thinking about this now. But one way to buy time in this exercise is to think of the battery as usable in multiple cycles for multiple applications. Initially in a car, and even after some depletion of the cells, what else can it be used as? And after further depletion of the cells, can it still be used in some residual way? If we lengthen the life of the battery by thinking about what all we can put it to use in, then perhaps we can buy ourselves the time to deal with its eventual disposal and reuse as well. But I think we're not really in a better position to say anything more than that right away. What are the safety standards being followed already for EVs in India? Are we at global par? It's hard to say. I mean, there's a perception historically that the electric vehicle was a little bit of a toy, that it was all right for people to tinker with. It can't really substitute for many of the things that we need in everyday life. And some states even don't allow electric vehicles to be used in the commercial sector. And there's a lot of history to that. But I think, and there's also a history to a certain amount of automobile safety itself in India, which has itself been a bit weak. Standardized airbags, for example, were quite late to come on to the market here. Seatbelts were quite late to come onto the market. Rear-facing car seats for children are still rare. So in a way, this whole, but at the same time, manufacturing-linked safety, like front ends of vehicles that can collapse on impact, those sorts of things did come. I don't think there's a way to answer this question of safety of electric vehicles separately from the safety of non-electric vehicles. Of course, electric vehicles are subject to a kind of risk that non-electric vehicles are not, and those things, well, like with the flooding, for example, we've sort of seen some interesting incidents in recent weeks. But I think there's a lot to be learned here before we're able to answer these questions definitively. I don't think there's any reluctance to go towards better standards of safety, and perhaps even the technology will naturally allow safety to be a higher consideration here. But this is still an emerging space. Ari, you want to say something now?
Well, Sorry, 10. Just move to 10. Down with it. Yeah. Well, we move to the countdown 10. That's half time on this session with Dr. Ashwin Mahesh. Ashwin, it's been a very engaging set of responses that we have received so far from you. And what is more interesting is that we have had at least a dozen questions or, sometimes insights that have come in from various listeners. We will share them with you at the end of it. And all of you participants, I request you to keep sending in on the chat box whatever you want to send in. Please know that the key speaker, Dr. Ashwin Mahesh, will not be seeing the chat box. It's not visible to him where he is sitting just now, but we will share it with him at the end of the countdown 10. Over to you, Ashwin.
Okay, we go on with question number 9. The automobile industry employs 19 million people, almost all of them on internal combustion engines. How quickly skill such a large workforce, and is 2030 an impossibly short time to make this happen? And this goes back to what I said earlier about this 2030. 2030 is a short time to make a lot of things happen. But how much of it happens, it depends on how well we hit our stride. There's an old quote from Abraham Lincoln: if you have only 1 hour to cut a tree, perhaps you should spend a little bit of time sharpening the axe to begin with. And if we spend the first year or two in sharpening the axe in some way to say that these steps that we take for electric vehicle adoption now will make accelerated adoption possible later, then it's all right. If we start 2 years later, and we can really add the numbers really quickly after that. But it's an interesting conversation I had with the skilling ministry some time ago, where this question came up, that in all emerging industries, we have to have a certain amount of focus on making sure that the workforce of the country is able to support the rapid growth of that industry as well. And so alongside manufacturing, alongside a whole bunch of finance, and alongside market development, we also have to develop the talent that can actually service these markets, and some focus that is emerging in this direction. Whether all of this can happen by 2030, I don't know, but I think if we get the basics right in the next 2-3 years, a very large number of people can be trained by 2030. It's also true that there's not much point in training them ahead of the availability of the vehicles, because then they're not going to get jobs. And so in a way, the market and the manpower have to synchronously grow. Well, what is, the net result of all this is that nobody seems to know how all of this is going to play out. The producer, the consumer, the auto workers, the companies, everybody is sort of feeling the elephant and saying, is this an elephant? Is this a tail? Is this a rope? Is this a trunk? What is this? And how are we going to come to answers about that? I actually don't know the answer, but I think I have an idea of where to look for the answer. And where to look for the answer is with services companies that provide transportation. Ultimately, clients and customers are buying services, mobility services. And therefore, the service provider is in the unique position of being able to say, there's somebody willing to pay for this. And then look over his shoulder, talk to a manufacturer, talk to a component maker, talk to an engineer, and say, in order for this market to develop, I need you to do things in a particular way and give it to me so that I can sell it downstream into the market. I think a very large part of the answer is going to be found by the service companies. We're seeing that the government itself is now talking more to the service companies as a result of this, because many of the things that they started to do in policy, they came to the conclusion that they really couldn't do much until they understood the service environment well. And so there's a lot more active engagement with transportation service companies to say, how about this and how about that? And that's where I would go look for the answer, and let those answers in turn deal with producers and consumers and auto workers and companies and so on. That's the way to look for the answer. Should we have charging stations all over the cities? And what about technology for quicker charging? Will it mean higher power surges and greater demand for power? I mean, overall, the shift to electric power is going to mean greater demand for electric power, but it's not necessarily mean greater demand for power. In fact, in transportation, because electric power is more efficiently used in powering the vehicle, so you could even see a drop in power as vehicles shift to EV. However, having said that, this question of charging infrastructure, there is charging infrastructure all over the world, except that we don't think of it as charging infrastructure. The building that you are in already has all the things you need to charge your car. And so it's a kind of charging infrastructure. It may not have been thought of that way, but as electric vehicles become more common, you can begin to appreciate that a vehicle can be charged in any building. Then comes the question of speed. Can it be charged quickly in every building? Well, if one of those walls had a socket that allowed fast charging, then you could charge it in every building. Then it becomes a question of, will the builders ever do that? Maybe, maybe not. Builders after all began to build homes with electric garage openers, which cost a few $1,000s for them. Could they begin to build faster charging sockets, which may also cost a few tens of thousands of rupees? Compared to the cost of a building, the cost of the charging infrastructure is trivial, and multiple vehicles could even use those in communities and campuses. So I actually think that more than public charging infrastructure, we should be thinking about how the mechanics of charging will come into buildings and think about the roadmap for that much more strongly. By going electric, are we only replacing one kind of dirty power, petroleum, with the kind of dirty power, uranium, coal, whatever it is? I actually don't think so. It doesn't have to be. The great thing about electric power is that it is potentially accompanied by the growing autonomy in accessing power. At the end of the day, you can put something on your roof, talk to the sun, and get an amount of power from it, and use that to do whatever it is that you do. So it's not just that we're seeing a transformation to electric power, we're seeing a transformation to autonomous power as well. And we are seeing a transformation to grid-based access to power. So you could generate clean energy elsewhere in the world and just figure out how to get it to where you are. And in a way, vehicles enable that. Electric enables that. It's just that being in the sense that its ability to look back and talk to clean sources of power across the grid to be able to autonomously run itself is much better than it was for fossil fuels, and therefore the potential to go to a more cleaner transformation is that much greater. Yes, as long as a lot of power continues to be generated from coal, we're still going to have that problem, but perhaps by making changes like this, we can accelerate the roadmap for production of power itself to go away from coal. Are there charging stations in anywhere in the world that sort of we can look at and say this is the way to do it and that's the way to do it? I think not. I actually think that what is possible today is very different from what was possible even 5 or 10 years ago. The falling cost of energy and the rising sophistication of technology are going to create possibilities that were simply not there in the past. I often say that how we live in cities, life in the city will change the nature of human existence on Earth. And we are living in that kind of a species moment where many, many things will become possible that were not possible even a few years ago. And this combination of falling cost of energy and rising strength of technology has a lot to do with that. So I wouldn't look to the past, but I would look to more creative models, like what I said about buildings, to say, can we think of each building as a charging point? Can we think of building construction as equivalent to setting up charging infrastructure? If we begin to think about the world in those ways, with Internet of Technologies, Internet of Things and Services hardwired into the built form, then I think we'll get outcomes that are much more powerful. Are there lessons that India can learn from Brazil and the hybrid vehicles that ran on ethanol, electricity, and oil? Yes and no. Hybrid effectively means carrying two technologies in the same vehicle. And there's a limit to how much you can do that. I think there was a time when hybrid offered a value that was clearly better than pure fossil. But I think we are now at a different time where the possibility of getting away from hybrid and going with pure clean is before us. And therefore, the more powerfully we embrace that possibility, the quicker we can get to that future. Today, I would see hybrid as slowing down the potential for doing good rather than accelerating it. 10 years ago, people may have thought of hybrid as accelerating the potential to do good. Today, we must think of hybrid as slowing down the potential to do good, because fundamentally you can go to the absolute clean technologies faster if you bypass hybrid. And for the same reason, retrofitting IC engines is not really a significant value proposition in my view. There are lots of people who will tell you the things that we are proposing to do will take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to come into being. Are there not things that we can do that are looking backwards to derive some small benefit in the short term as well? I think the answer to that is no. That if we look back and try to fix some problems of the past, knowing fully well that their value is only in the short term, we might slow down the emergence of the alternative. And honestly, accelerating the emergence of the alternative is vastly more important than anything that we can do looking back. The good news is that, when it comes to, for example, buildings, 2/3 of all the buildings in the developing world that will exist in 20 years have not yet been built. So the opportunity to think about the future very differently still exists. Almost 80% of the vehicles that will exist in the next 20 years, why 80%? Close to 100% of the vehicles that will exist in the next 15 to 20 years have not already been built. So can we now begin to just embrace that future faster? Can we embrace modular manufacturing and extend the life cycles of what we build in the future? If I had to put a certain amount of focus into engineering, that's where I would put it. Can the market for electric cars be made much more powerful if batteries could be rented? I think the answer is quite evidently yes. And I think if a modular way of renting 2 batteries and charging them at home were to emerge, then it would be even more powerful. There are things like that can happen. Manufacturers weren't able to do that. But until the emergence of GST, this was one thing that wasn't quite straightforward. I'm hoping now that with GST, battery leasing and battery renting will become much more clean in a financial way. And we're still exploring some of that. But it's certainly true that lowering the cost of the battery, the lowering cost of any part of the car will make the car more likely to be bought. So that goes without saying. Because the battery is a significant part of the cost, yes, there is reason to have special emphasis on it. But lowering the total cost could be a sharper focus, because financing, strictly speaking, can be done even today. That if you set up a leasing arrangement, you could begin to go down this road even today. But we have to be careful that a battery that is separately financeable may lead us closer to a swapping market, even if we feel that charging is the better way to go. We sort of have to be careful about things like that. And now we're down to the last question. Even today, cars and two-wheelers cannot be bought on EMIs. What does it take to remove this? And how do we get to financing very large numbers of vehicles and getting them bought as though they were buying, computers and laptops and phones in markets? Well, it's hard to say. I actually think that maybe one of the reasons this can be done is that the prices are somewhat higher than for most of the things that you can do on EMIs. But certainly we're seeing that new financial instruments are emerging that allow significant assets also to be bought and paid for over time. This is much more of a finance question. And I think the good news in a lot of what I've been saying today, one of the things that I see as a positive sign is that the emergence of the electric vehicle sector is now being led by commercial organizations that plan to use these vehicles in fleets. And there's something good that will come of that, because commercial organizations are much better at structuring new products, both financial products and physical products and services. And as a result of that, it's quite conceivable that new financial instruments can also be built. These are much easier to build between companies and banks than they are to build between individual vehicle owners and banks. So perhaps it's something that we can look at and do as well. We would certainly think about it at Lithium and see how much can be done. For me, the journey so far has been quite interesting. We've put about 400 cars on the street in Bangalore and in Delhi. But more than putting the cars on the street itself, what we have been able to do is understand the totality of the ecosystem that is needed to make electric vehicles numerous and powerful in India, whether it's production and charging infrastructure and services and engineering talent and just consumer awareness, finance, all of these pieces. It seems like we are simultaneously engaged in the process of building a business and the process of building the ecosystem around that business. It's potentially an exciting time and a transformative time. And the good news is that all the projections from around the world say that India may end up with 1/5 of the global electric vehicles over time. And if that is the case, there's no reason why we can't be among the most competitive nations in the world in this space. Making that happen is the challenge of the next 15, 20 years. Thank you.
Sure. Sure. I might add that, what Ashwin didn't say is that Lithium has offered him and the others in the company a very unique vantage point to be interacting with various stakeholders, from manufacturers to battery producers and so on, including the government. As a matter of fact,
I kind of feel bad telling this to you guys who are energy distributors, but my feeling is that in about 10 or 15 years, your business will not exist. You really have to reimagine energy distribution and energy pricing. And to be in a vantage point at which you can sort of see this and be able to understand this and respond to it is really an exciting thing for us.
sure. Thank you for making this happen in less than 40 minutes. It's been pretty competent. All you listeners out there, I'm guessing that it's been very engaging and interesting. Maybe I speak for you. Uh, the one thing that seems to come out simply with all that Ashwin did is that if that vision for 2030 is to be realized, first we should not focus on the outcome. It's very hard for him or for anyone to be actually seeing what that vision would be. But what he effectively said was that he knows where to look for the solutions. And that, I think, is important, ladies and gentlemen. If you were to listen to this recording again, and it will be put up on the YouTube/Response Cities in a day or two from now, you could, of course, write to Ankita at the mail ID that shows up here. You will then see how, on a re-listening to what Ashwin has had to offer, there would be patterns that you will find yourself. If there is a crystal ball gazer who could be effective and who could help us see what that can be in the next 12, 13 years, there can't be anyone better than Ashwin Mahesh. The other that we heard from him today is that whether it's technology or whether it's recognition of the product in the marketplace or production, being first the challenge and not market acceptance itself, in all this, he's saying only one thing. He's saying we are at the cusp of a change. We are in the second decade of this century. It is like 1895 and what classical mechanics did not or could not do at that point of time, as he said very nicely. The last thing I would want to say is this, and he said it very poignantly, and I'm quoting him. We are at a species moment where behavior change of human existence in itself is going to be played out over the next decade and a half or so. Thank you once again for being with us. Thank you, Ashwin, for all the time that you've offered us.
Thank you, Hari. It was my pleasure.